Good evening and welcome to the 16th Annual Salant Lecture. I'm Alice Knapp, Executive Director of the New Canaan Library, and it is truly my pleasure to welcome you to St. Luke's, who has just been a wonderful partner for this event. From the first phone call saying, oh no, we need more space, to the last minute preparations, they have been wonderful. And I just wanted to say a couple words about the St. Luke School, because this is for them a perfect way to celebrate the school's new Center for Leadership and Global Classroom, and for them to welcome you here for this Salant Lecture. The Center for Leadership in St. Luke School was created and built this past summer to help all St. Luke students develop their own unique ability to lead and make a difference. This is accomplished by providing experiences such as this lecture, service learning opportunities, and cultural exchange programs that encourages students to acquire global perspectives, a service orientation, and what they call TLC skills: teamwork, leadership, and communication, all of which help our students live the St. Luke's motto, enter to learn, go forth to serve. Please join us after the talk for a reception in the new Fireplace Commons, where you'll actually be able to see the Center for Leadership firsthand just by looking up, and it's absolutely gorgeous. This afternoon, our question and answer format is going to be slightly different. Instead of us passing a mic around, we are going to have 4 people stationed with microphones, and we ask you go to those people stationed. And once again, I want to thank you for joining us today, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Sarah Salant Gleason. Sarah is the youngest child of Richard and Frances Salant. She lives in Darien with her husband Jim and their children.
All right, I promise I will keep this short, because I'm sure you don't want a whole list of people coming up here and making more and more introductions, that we really want to get to the star of our show tonight. But let me just take a moment and say a couple of thank yous, if I might. First of all, I want to start off by thanking the audience. You're the ones who come year after year and make this lecture series such an incredible success with your ongoing support. We are now, I think, on year 16, which is quite really incredible. I was talking to some of my sisters last night, and we were talking about the event this weekend, and I told them that we were now moving to this venue because we were sold out and too big to be in the library, and they were just thrilled to hear that this is still so vibrant and so strong. So thank you. To Scott, to you and those who have been here before you to share their stories, to share their thoughts. You are the ones who really help make it as vibrant as it is and keep these audiences coming year after year. So thank you very much. We're thrilled to have you here. I'm sure Dad's smiling down upon us all. To Alice, to Cindy, to the New Canaan Library, I want to pay particular thanks this year, because as this has become a little bit more difficult for Mom to spearhead, you all really came up with a great new plan involving Tracy McManus and others to figure out a way to keep this as vital as it is. And I think the fact that this audience is as large as it is testament to that. So again, thank you to you all. On a personal note, I just want to say I cannot thank all those people enough, because not only on behalf of myself but my siblings, this is a really important connection for us with our father. It's our way to sort of see him, feel him in the spirit of everything that gets done here. And on behalf of me and my family, thank you very much, because it is a way for my 4 boys to have some perspective and understanding about the grandfather that they really never got to meet. And that is really, really special for us and special for them. And it is really delightful for me to be able to therefore introduce my eldest son, Nathan, who we are passing the baton to, as we started to last year, who will actually make the formal introduction. So thank you all.
Hello, everyone. I must thank the New Canaan Library for asking me to come back and introduce our speaker tonight. It is an honor to be back after, putting it nicely, stumbling through my intro last year. Last year I talked about how it amazes me that I was able to connect to my grandfather and realize his accomplishments in the news industry. It was also wonderful to talk about the grandfather I have no recollection of and was only able to grasp a finger of before he was gone. And yet, standing at the podium last year, I had a completely different realization than I was expecting. I was expecting that by giving the intro, I would learn more about his endeavors. Instead, I learned the number of lives he touched. I had the epiphany that even though he is gone, he still touches lives on a daily basis. Whether it is a bunch of lives like tonight, or a few through the marks he's left on the news industry. Either way, it amazes me to know this guy, Richard Salant, my grandfather, could have such a big impact. To me, he has come to represent a lot. He represents the ability to touch lives indirectly. He represents that hard work pays off. And finally, even though I do not have the memory, he represents always being there for family. I admire him and all he stood for. It is this character that I want to aspire to. And without further ado, I would like to give you a little more background information on our wonderful speaker tonight. Scott Pelley, one of the most experienced reporters in broadcast journalism. He was named anchor and managing editor of CBS Evening News in May 2011. Pelley is also correspondent for CBS News magazine 60 Minutes. Pelley's career started in New York in 1989. Since then, he's covered breaking national news stories, politics, and war. From 1997 to 1999, he served as the network's chief White House correspondent. In 2001, Pelley reported from the scene of the collapsing World Trade Center towers. In the years following, he reported extensively from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Pelley came to 60 Minutes in 2004. Since that time, half of all the major awards won by that broadcast have been won by Pelley's team of producers, reporters, photographers, and editors. All told, Pelley and his team have received an Alfred I DuPont Columbia Silver Baton, 2 George Foster's Peabody Awards, 15 National Emmy Awards, 5 Edward R. Murrow Awards, a George Polk and Loeb Award, as well as honors from the Society of Professional Journalists, investigative reporters, and editors, and the Writers Guild of America. 21 of those awards have been earned for his work over the past 5 years on 60 Minutes. Pelley serves on the board of directors and International Rescue Committee, the Refugee Relief Agency headquarters in New York City. He is the co-chair of the IRC's Board of Overseers. He was inducted into the Texas Tech University Alumni Hall of Fame and serves on the board of the university's School of Mass Communications. Prior to his time at CBS News, Pelley was a producer/reporter at the WFAA-TV Dallas-Fort Worth from 1982 to 1989, KXAS-TV Dallas-Fort Worth from 1978 to 1981, and KSEL-TV Lubbock, Texas from 1975 to 1978. He began his journalism career at the age of 15 as a copy boy at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal newspaper. Scott Pelley was born in San Antonio, Texas, and attended journalism school at Texas Tech University. He and his wife, Jane Boone Pelley, have a son and daughter. So without further ado, Scott Pelley.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Nathan, that was so comprehensive, I'm not sure I have anything else to say. You know, Nathan, you mentioned that you like to believe that your grandfather touches the lives of people even today. Well, let me tell you that he touches the lives of millions of people every day, because Richard Salant wrote the rules at CBS News, and they're the rules that we live by today. And we would not be the news organization that we are without your grandfather. So he was a wonderful, wonderful man. Ladies and gentlemen, it's so good to be with you. So good to be with you. It's so kind of St. Luke's to give us this terrific venue tonight. I understood that the library was going to be a little bit oversubscribed, and so it's really a great pleasure to be with you. I don't know why New Canaan produces so many great CBS News presidents, but it seems to. There was Richard Salant, Sean McManus, Jeff Fager, one after another. So whatever you're doing here in New Canaan, please keep it up, because we can really use this talent. Thank you very much. You know, I'm just reaching into my briefcase. Oh, wait a minute. Here are my notes right here. Because there was something that I noticed about Dick Salant's memorial service. There were a number of very distinguished speakers that day, and one of the eulogists said this about Dick. Dick didn't so much do things as he prevented things from being done. He held to journalistic standards. Dick was determined that CBS News would give people what they ought to know, not what they wanted to hear. He did not try to make CBS News popular, and with that philosophy, he made it the most popular. I want to put this, the eulogist said, as delicately as I know how. I'm sure this was a reference to the fact that Dick wrote the standards and adhered to the standards and forced all of us at CBS News to adhere to the standards that he created. I want to put this as delicately as I know how, but to tell you the truth, Dick could be a pain in the ass. The eulogist was Andy Rooney. How could it have been otherwise? And in fact, for those of you who may remember when the Salant Room was dedicated at the library, it was Andy Rooney who made that dedication. As many of you know by now, we lost Andy on Friday, about 4 weeks after his retirement from 60 Minutes, 30 years at 60 Minutes. Apparently, on Friday night, God needed a writer, and so he called Andy home. It has been my happy duty the last several years to be the one at the beginning of 60 Minutes to say those stories and Andy Rooney tonight on 60 Minutes. And for the first time, about 3 weeks ago, I'm just making a little modification in the microphone here. For the first time about 3 weeks ago, I'm now untethered and free. I had to sit in the 60 Minutes studio, and I looked into the camera and I said, those stories tonight on 60 Minutes. And it just didn't have the right ring to it. We missed Andy from the very first day. And of course, we and millions of other people all across the country will now miss his brilliant, brilliant work. He hid the genius of a philosopher behind the honest prose of every man. And we will not see the like of Andy again for a very long time, I fear. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been such a privilege to be at 60 Minutes. People often ask me what some of my favorite interviews were during the time that we've been working over the past few years. And one of the things that came up just last year was the story of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. You'll recall that this was the biggest drilling disaster in history. The Deepwater Horizon exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, taking 11 lives and creating the largest accidental oil spill in history. The key to 60 Minutes, what Don Hewitt always told us, was to find characters who can tell the story better than we can. That's the secret. And we were looking for just the right person to tell us the story of what happened in this dramatic event. This was just about 3 weeks after it happened, and so the whole country was still curious about what had happened, how did it happen, how did the safest ship in the drilling fleet end up like this? So we put a team of 60 Minutes producers and reporters on it, about 25 people, and we went through the manifest of all of the survivors, and we found a guy named Mike Williams. Now, Mike Williams was key to learning what happened on the Deepwater Horizon, because what you should know about these drilling rigs these days is they're like the space shuttle, unbelievably sophisticated. Everything's run by computers, everything is electronic, and Mike was the chief electronics technician on the ship. He knew everything about the ship, from the drilling systems to the safety systems, and we convinced Mike to sit down and tell us what he knew. And it turned out, as is so often the case on 60 Minutes, it turned out he knew a lot that the public did not know. So we sat down with Mike about 3 weeks after this disaster, and he recalled the time of the explosion when he was sitting in his shop on board, the electronics shop, and methane gas came shooting up from 5 miles below, came up into the rig, started spreading across the decks, and the first thing that happened was the enormous engines on the ship that generate all of the electricity started sucking methane gas into their vents, which caused the engines to speed up and run wild. Here's a little bit of what Mike told us about that moment.
The engine's revving. The lights are glowing. I'm hearing the alarms. I mean, they're at a constant state now. It's just beep, 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 beep. It doesn't stop. But even that's starting to get drowned out by the sound of the engine increasing in speed. And my lights get so incredibly bright that they physically explode. I'm pushing my way back from the desk when my computer monitor exploded, and I reached for the door to exit my shop. These are 3-inch thick steel fire-rated doors with 6 stainless steel hinges supporting them on the frame. As I reached for the handle, I heard this awful hissing noise, this whoosh, and at the height of the hiss, a huge explosion. The explosion literally rips the door from the hinges, impacts me and takes me to the other side of the shop. And I'm up against the wall when I finally come around with a door on top of me. And I remember thinking to myself, you know, this is it. I'm gonna die right here. As I got to the next door, it exploded and took me, the door, and slid me about 35 feet backwards again and planted me up against another wall. At that point, I actually got angry. I was mad at the doors. I was mad that these fire doors that are supposed to protect me are hurting me. These fire doors are trying to kill me. And at that point, I made a decision. I'm going to get outside. I may die out there, but I'm going to get outside.
That very night, company executives had flown by helicopter out to the Deepwater Horizon to give the crew an award for being the safest ship in the fleet. They had practiced the lifeboat drills every Sunday morning on the ship to make sure that in the event of something like this, no one would be left behind. Mike Williams got out of his electronic shop, got up onto the deck, and found that all of the lifeboats were gone. They had left him and several other crew members on the burning rig. Mike remembered that he was standing there with a life jacket on, and standing next to him was another crew member named Andrea. And with blood in his eyes, fire at his back, and the sea below, he made his decision.
I remember looking at Andrea and telling her, or looking at her and seeing that look in her eyes of she had quit. She had given up. I remember her saying, "I'm scared." And I said, "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too." She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "We're going to burn up or we're going to jump." And she said she couldn't jump. I remember telling her, "If you don't jump, I'm going to throw you. We have to get off of here. We can't stay here."
How far is it to the sea?
Maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways. I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off the end of the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
He and Andrea plummeted off the end of the rig 100 feet, down into the sea, and then popped back up like corks because of their life preservers, and then they could see in the distance the sea was on fire. And Mike thought, well, what have I done now? At least I was dry up there, now I'm going to burn up down here. But it was just in that moment, covered in oil, that Mike could hear in the distance, "Over here, over here." There was a flotilla of fishing boats converging on this burning rig. They had seen what happened, they had heard what happened on the radio, and they came to the rescue. And Mike and all the other survivors were pulled up out of the water and brought to shore. Now, this is about, as I mentioned, this broadcast was about 3 weeks after the disaster, and everyone had lots of questions about how on earth this could happen. Oil was pouring into the Gulf of Mexico. You remember how they couldn't cap the well for many, many weeks after the disaster. Congress was having hearings in the House and in the Senate, and many witnesses had been heard from, and there was very little information about what had happened, especially from the companies that were involved. What Mike told us on 60 Minutes, and this is exactly the heritage of Dick Salant, because we were going for the information that no one knew and expending an enormous amount of effort to find that. What Mike told us on 60 Minutes was this well had been difficult for weeks, that there had been accidents. In one of the drilling accidents, many days before this happened, there was damage to the blowout preventer. Now, the blowout preventer is an enormous piece of machinery, millions of dollars, that sits down on the seabed. And it's designed, if things go wrong, to cut off the well and prevent the explosion and prevent the oil spill. But the blowout preventer didn't work in this case. And Mike was able to tell us that there had been an accident on the drilling platform a few weeks before. The blowout preventer had been damaged. They knew that, but they decided that rather than replace it, which would cost millions of dollars, they'd just keep going because they were almost finished with the well. So they would just go right on ahead. Well, the Monday after this aired, those congressional hearings were still ongoing. And Mike Williams had told us on 60 Minutes so much more than anybody knew. The witness before the congressional hearings that Monday morning was Ken Salazar. Ken is the Secretary of the Interior, and as such is the person responsible for safety of drilling offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. Here's what happened on Capitol Hill the next morning.
Last night I saw the rerun of in fact I saw it 3 times. Mike Williams on 60 Minutes, I'm sure all of you saw that.
I did not watch the 60-minute episode that you referred to.
60 Minutes did a piece, as is so often the case, that I thought was really interesting.
We hear from on 60 Minutes what we couldn't hear from industry witnesses.
I don't know if you had the chance to see the 60 Minutes, call it expose.
I did not watch the 60-minute program.
Goodness.
I watched 60 Minutes on Sunday.
I did not watch it because I have been working on the Gulf incident nonstop, so I did not
This is the Gulf incident we're talking about.
So the moral of that story is don't miss 60 Minutes, which will be coming on here in about an hour and a half, so I need to get you guys out of here. One of the things that we've been working on at the CBS Evening News and at 60 Minutes is this place that the country seems to be stuck in where nothing is happening in Washington. There's the crisis over the deficit and what we should do about that, whether there should be tax increases, whether there should be spending cuts, whether there should be one or the other or both. And nobody on Capitol Hill seems to be able to get to the bottom of how to move the country past that point at this incredibly delicate moment for our economy. We've done a few interviews recently with the President and others about just this point, and I'd like to share a little bit of that with you now. Speaker Boehner said this morning that the debt ceiling is the President's problem. Full stop.
Well, I want the public to understand that this is a debt that was accumulated by previous Congresses. So Speaker Boehner, Mitch McConnell, Mr. Cantor, Mr. Kyle, all these folks put in place policies that helped to create this debt. And in fact, all of them have voted to raise the debt ceiling previously when there was a Republican president in place. So this is not a Republican or a Democratic problem. This is a national problem that has to be resolved. And the way it's going to get resolved is if all of us make some compromises and we take a balanced approach that finally deals with this debt and deficit in a serious way.
But the Republicans don't see it that way. The minority leader, Senator McConnell, today said in the Senate, there will be no solution to entitlements or the debt as long as this president is in office.
Well, let me say this. Mr. McConnell said, I think the day I was elected, that his job was to try to see me beat. I think what the American people are looking for is not that kind of partisan politics. What the American people are looking for is somebody to solve problems. And Scott, let's just back up. What we've gone through is the worst recession since the Great Depression. The economy has recovered, but that recovery is still weak. This debt ceiling has routinely been raised, and what I'm offering is a way for us to finally solve this debt and deficit problem in a serious way with substantial cuts in discretionary spending, substantial cuts in defense spending, substantial changes to entitlements like Medicare and Social Security that would stabilize those programs and make them available for the next generation. And what I'm asking in return from the Republicans is that people like myself who can afford it, that millionaires and billionaires or corporate jet owners or oil companies put a little bit of revenue in so that we don't end up having to put the entire burden of dealing with this debt on the backs of middle-class families and seniors and students and poor kids. And I think that's a pretty sensible way to approach this that the vast majority of Americans agree with.
After we did this interview, we were at the White House and we were walking to a location where we were going to shoot a picture of the President and I walking together. And I asked him the question I always ask presidents. I said, so how do you like the job? And he said, you know, it's great. And then he put his hand over the microphone on his lapel and he leaned into me and he said, except for the Congress. The president's in an interesting place now. We are now within 1 year of Election Day. We just crossed that threshold. And I will suggest to you that there are three numbers that the White House is looking very closely at: 9, 48, and 0.4. 9 is the unemployment rate. We've been at about 9% unemployment for 28 months. No president since FDR has been reelected with an unemployment rate over 7.6. there is not much likelihood we're going to be very much below 9 on Election Day. 48. 48 is the number that history will tell you a president must have in the Gallup poll in terms of his job approval rating in order to be reelected. No president in modern times has been reelected with a job approval rating in the Gallup poll below 48. We just did a CBS News New York Times poll, and the job approval rating for this president was 46. And 0.4. 0.4 is the margin by which the president won North Carolina in the last election. He won North Carolina by 0.4%. Now, of course, in our winner-take-all system, it doesn't matter how much you win by 0.1%, you get all the delegates from that state. But the unemployment rate in North Carolina is now double what it was when the president took office. This is a hill to climb for the president. Now, the other side of the balance sheet is no one's very excited about the Republican candidates. Republicans are not excited about the Republican candidates. In the CBS News New York Times poll I just mentioned to you, we asked Republican voters, would you like to have another choice? 80% said yes. You can't get 80% of Americans to agree on motherhood. 80% said they wanted another choice. So this is going to be a fascinating election period. If the president manages to be reelected, he will be bucking powerful trends in history. The Republicans have an opportunity here, but they don't have any candidates that the Republicans seem to be all that excited about. The president's nemesis in all of this, of course, has been the Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner. I would call them smoking buddies because they both smoke. But buddies, I don't think, works in that relationship. Here's a moment that we had with Speaker Boehner a short while ago.
You know, a lot of folks at home see this as a train wreck, and they're angry about it. I wonder if you understand their feelings.
I do. I talk to people all day, every day. And the business of legislating in a divided government really is never pretty. You know, you've heard the old adage, there's two things you should never watch. Laws being made and sausage being made. And what we've got is we've got divided government here in Washington. We've got big issues confronting us, and we have a very open process and open society. And as a result, we have healthy debates about how to move forward. This has certainly been a long, healthy debate, but it's not pretty.
How did the grand bargain fail?
You know, I did everything I could to try to come to an agreement with the president. And unfortunately, he just kept insisting on new taxes. I made pretty clear throughout the spring that we weren't going to raise the debt limit without serious cuts in spending and changes to the way we spend the American people's money. And secondly, that we weren't going to have any new taxes. I even went to New York, to the New York Economic Club, gave a speech where I said that the cuts have to be larger than the increase in the debt ceiling. And people here in Washington thought I was crazy. But the fact is, when you've got a credit card that's out of control and over its limit, and you're asking the limit to be increased, you've got to do something about the source of the problem. And Washington spends too much money.
The super committee, which is designed to accomplish what the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House could not accomplish a couple of months ago, has just 3 weeks left in order to find a way to solve the deficit problem without these draconian across-the-board cuts falling into place automatically. They have 3 weeks to go, and there is not much sign at this point that they have made very much progress at all. Stay tuned to the CBS Evening News, and we will keep you abreast on what's going on. You know, one of the great perks of being a senior executive in the government, being the president or a cabinet minister, is a lot of people don't know this. You actually get to go to the National Gallery and tell them what paintings that you want hanging in your office. Now, most of the National Gallery is not on display. It's all in warehouses, of course, and so you can select from all of these great masters and have them put them up in your office. Well, I was visiting with Speaker Boehner during the nadir of this moment. He looked crushed. He was smoking, chain smoking, one cigarette after another in his office, blowing the smoke in my face, talking about all of these problems that they were having negotiating with the president. So I noticed, I thought I would cheer him up, I noticed one of his paintings hanging in there. It was a painting of the Congress in the 19th century, and it was the whole congressional chamber filled up, and there were people going around lighting oil lamps because they were going into a night session. Beautiful, large portrait on the wall. And so I asked him about it, and he told me who the painter was and how it came to be painted and all of that. And at the end he said, well, of course it's a copy. And I said, a copy, Mr. Speaker? Why would that be? And he goes, well, the National Gallery won't let me have any originals because I smoke. So what they do is they take photographs of the great paintings that the Speaker wants to have in his office, and they blow them up and frame them up beautifully and hang them as if they were the originals. Now, did you notice that the President's health report came out this last week, and the President's doctor certified that he'd stopped smoking? I'm here to tell you, though, he chews Nicorette like a fiend. So one thing these two men have in common is that nicotine habit. The difficulties that the country is in today, of course, all started with the economic collapse in 2008. And I thought for 60 Minutes that in this historic moment for our country, it was time for the Federal Reserve Chairman to appear on 60 Minutes. Now, no Fed chairman had been interviewed in more than 30 years. It is not done. But I picked up the phone and I called the Federal Reserve and I said, you know, I think it's time that Mr. Bernanke sat down on 60 Minutes. And the person I was talking to laughed out loud and said, the chairman does not do interviews.
We're sitting on this corner where your family store was, and I see it's Main Street.
Yes?
People feel like guys like you are tuned into what happens on Wall Street, and you forget places like this.
You know, I come from Main Street. That's my background. And I've never been on Wall Street. And I care about Wall Street for one reason and one reason only, because what happens on Wall Street matters to Main Street. And if we don't have stabilization in the financial markets, if we don't take the steps necessary to make sure that credit is flowing again, then my father couldn't get a loan to build his new store.
That was Ben Bernanke in Dillon, South Carolina, where he grew up. He was the smartest kid in town, in that little bitty town. When they told the Bernanke family that they didn't offer calculus at the high school, Ben taught himself calculus at home. He is one of the world's leading authorities on the causes of the Great Depression. That was his academic specialty. He went to Harvard. It's funny, you know, his mother didn't want him to go to Harvard. She said he didn't have the clothes. But he went on to Harvard, became the chairman of the economics department at Princeton. And his academic specialty, the thing that he spent his entire career working on, was the causes of the Great Depression. So at the moment in 2008, when the financial system collapses, the person who is chairman of the Fed is an expert in what happened in 1929. And what Ben Bernanke knew about that moment and the Fed's role in the Great Depression was that the Federal Reserve, after the crash, soaked up as much liquidity as possible in the national financial system. And Bernanke believes, and many others do as well, that it was the Federal Reserve that caused a recession and a panic to become the worldwide calamity that we know as the Great Depression. So what did he do? He did exactly the opposite. When the Congress was debating what to do, and the President was waiting for the Congress to figure out how to get us out of this jam, and days were going by, Ben Bernanke, all by himself, threw $1 trillion into the banking system off the Fed balance sheet. And then when that wasn't quite enough, he threw another $1 trillion at the problem. Federal Reserve had no history of doing anything of the kind. It had never been done before. He was making all of this up and doing it on his own, while everyone else in Washington was debating the right steps to take. Flooded the system with liquidity. Now, as we've talked about already, the country is still in a terrible jam with regard to the economy, but I believe that Ben Bernanke may have saved the world from another Great Depression. Reasonable people will disagree about what the Fed has done and is doing, but I think his decisive action in that moment in time allowed us to avoid another Great Depression. Now you wonder, where does somebody get the kind of background, the kind of life experience that would lead them to do something financially so brave, so novel in that moment? And I asked Ben Bernanke where he had worked before he started his academic career. And this was one of those places. Ben Bernanke. This is south of the border, which is outside of Dillon, South Carolina, on the interstate. If you've ever driven to Florida, you've been by this place. Ben Bernanke, the future chairman of the Federal Reserve, wore a poncho and waited tables at south of the border during the summers when he was at Harvard. And I asked him, well, what did you learn there? And he said, I learned that work is hard. Now, one of the things that has been transformative to so many people in this room, and transformative to me personally as a reporter, were the events of 10 years ago. When the first tower was struck, no one knew what was happening in that moment. And so we realized whatever it was important. And we took a large team of people from 60 Minutes and sent them down to Ground Zero. And while we were all en route to Ground Zero, the second airplane struck, and then the world knew what was happening. When I arrived at Ground Zero, the towers were still burning. And the first thing I thought was a sense of relief, because the towers had not collapsed. And I was amazed by that. I had covered the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, and the fact that I remembered from that was that at any given moment there were 25,000 people in each building. And the fact that the buildings were still standing amazed me and relieved me. I remember looking at the top of one of the towers, and I thought that I saw it move, and I assumed that it was just a trick of the heat and in the light. And then, and people say this, but I'm here to tell you that it's absolutely true, it seemed to happen in slow motion. It was like I saw the 110th floor hit 109 and 109 hit 108, and it started to gather speed. And so the next thing I rationalized was that it would stop. It would fall a certain distance and then it would stop. Of course, it picked up speed, supersonic speed, and came crashing to the ground, and then the second building behind it, and we all ran away. When that moment was over, we turned with my 60 Minutes colleagues and I and went back into the scene, and it was like the first heavy snowfall of winter. It was absolutely silent. And that dust that was created in the collapse began to drift in the streets and the avenues all around the World Trade Center. We saw fire trucks that were no taller than this and taxi cabs that were no taller than that. And as we made our way to the center, the thing that struck me, the thing that was surreal, was that there was nothing from the towers that was recognizable. I mean, imagine all of the desks and chairs and phones and computers and filing cabinets and doors and carpet and office furniture that was in those towers. There was nothing, absolutely nothing but that powder that was drifting in the streets. We looked up and we did see paper. Paper very slowly circling down. It was pages out of desk calendars and Christmas cards and family photos and all of those things. The paper had managed to survive, but nothing other than that. 343 members of the FDNY were killed that day. All of you know that. Folks that live around this part of the country don't forget that. And the thing that strikes me about that sacrifice is this. So many people, including myself, were surprised when we found out that if you burn steel hot enough and long enough, it becomes plastic, it becomes weak, and it begins to fail. There was even controversy after the World Trade Center towers collapsed about how steel buildings could possibly collapse. But you think about it, I mean, that's how they make steel, isn't it? They heat it up until it's molten and they pour it into beams. No one really knew that. But the firemen knew. They'd all been trained. They knew very well that if you burn steel for a certain period of time, it will go plastic and begin to collapse. But they went up those stairwells anyway, with the full knowledge of what was going to happen. 343 of them. The great miracle of that day is that the evacuation was so successful. Nearly everyone below the point of impact on both buildings managed to escape. Untold thousands of lives were saved because of the heroic efforts of the police officers and the Port Authority officers and those 343 members of the FDNY. We just marked the 10th anniversary with the opening of the Ground Zero Memorial, the National Memorial down there at the World Trade Center site. And if you haven't been there, rush to see it. You cannot imagine, and you can't grasp from television, the enormous power of those wonderful waterfalls that have been built in the footprints of the former Trade Center towers, and the names of everyone who perished around the borders of those waterfalls. It is a transformative experience. If you were hurt by that event, either personally or as an American, I really recommend that you go down there and see that magnificent, magnificent memorial. About a year after 9/11, we had an opportunity to do an hour-long 60 Minutes, a fairly rare thing, with the President of the United States. We wanted to find out what his day had been like 1 year before. What was that all about? As you recall, the President was not in Washington when it happened. He was in Florida. They put him back on Air Force One, where you see us now. And we shot a lot of the piece on Air Force One because that's where he'd spent the day. They weren't sure about bringing the President back to Washington, so he spent a great deal of the day flying on Air Force One. On Air Force One, the main corridor through the aircraft is on the left-hand side next to the windows, and those are all the President's offices and conference rooms and his own bedroom up front in the airplane. And we did an interview in his office on Air Force One, and I talked to him about a decision that he made that he was so personally moved by. He had to leave his staff in his office and go up forward into his own bedroom in order to pick up the phone and issue this order to the Air Force on that morning.
There's a bedroom here that's got phones up front, and I actually left the office here to go give the order to prepare our aircraft to shoot down our own commercial airliners should they be, should they violate certain airspace rules or transponder rules.
Why did you walk in the other cabin to give that order?
I don't know. I can't remember. It just did. It's, maybe it was one of those moments where I wanted to be alone.
Tough order.
It's a tough order. It's a tough one to give. It's just, it kind of, in retrospect, that order reminds us of how serious the moment was. When your country's under attack, and you're not sure if there's going to be another attack, you got to do everything you can to protect the American people. And the idea of ordering our own aircraft to shoot down our own aircraft is a tough call, but it was, I didn't hesitate. It was the right thing to do.
On that flight, when we were shooting those interviews with the president, we were flying from Washington to Oregon. The president was going to a forestry event. And after the interview in his office there on the airplane, he needed to change clothes. He wanted to get into something a little more outdoorsy so that he could go to this forestry event. And he excused himself and went up forward into his private cabin. And my crew and I were pulling the lights down and getting the cameras finished and all of that. Well, apparently, after the president went forward, he realized that there was something that he meant to tell me, but he forgot what it was. So he came back in. I have no idea what the President of the United States told me in that moment, because he wasn't wearing a shirt. I am looking him straight in the eye, and I'm thinking, don't look down, don't look down, don't look down, don't look down. And the president goes on and on. I don't hear a word that he says. That's the kind of guy George Bush is. It didn't occur to him that it would be strange. And he turned around and went back up into his cabin, and my crew and I, we all looked at each other and said, well, you don't see that every day. You get such a window on these people when you have an opportunity to be with them, as I do. I'm the luckiest man you'll ever meet to be able to have smoke blown in my face by the Speaker of the House, and to listen to his tales of woe, and to be with the presidents at their unguarded, to say the least, unguarded moments. You know, after 9/11, 60 Minutes did a story. Mike Wallace, my dear friend, my hero and my mentor, Mike Wallace did a story that I was really angry about. He did a story for 60 Minutes about whether the United States would resort to torture in order to get information. You'll remember what those days were like. We were concerned that there would be another attack on the country. We needed information. And the question of whether we would coerce that information out of terrorism suspects came up. I was angry about the story because I thought it was ridiculous. Of course we wouldn't do anything like that. It was absurd. And then we began to hear about waterboarding and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the mastermind of 9/11, and how he was waterboarded more than 150 times in order to get information. I had an opportunity to sit down with the director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, who was the DCI from the period before 9/11, during and after 9/11, and in the run-up to the Iraq War. It was George Tenet's CIA who came up with the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be false. But when we were doing our interview, we sat for 8 hours over 2 days, because he had a lot to talk about and a lot to answer for as DCI for the long period of time he was there. George had never done an interview in his life. Directors of Central Intelligence are sort of that way. I'd asked him at a party, actually, a couple of years before. I said, you know, it's time for you to sit down on 60 Minutes. And he leaned up to me and he said, my lips are sealed. But it finally came a time where he had had so much criticism, he'd had so much he wanted to say. He did sit down with 60 Minutes, and the subject of torture came up.
You know, the image that's been portrayed is we sat around the campfire and said, oh boy, now we go get to torture people. Well, we don't torture people. Let me say that again to you. We don't torture people, okay?
Come on, George.
We don't torture people.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
We don't torture people.
Waterboarding.
We do not, I don't
It's
talk about
torture.
techniques, and we don't torture people. Now listen to me. I want you to listen to me. So the context is, it's post 9/11. I've got reports of nuclear weapons in New York City, apartment buildings that are going to be blown up, planes that are going to fly into airports all over again, plot lines that I don't know. I don't know what's going on inside the United States, and I'm struggling to find out where the next disaster is going to occur. Everybody forgets one central context of what we lived through. The palpable fear that we felt on the basis of the fact that there was so much we did not know. I know that this program has saved lives. I know we've disrupted plots.
But what you're essentially saying is some people need to be tortured.
No, I did not say that. I did not say that.
You're telling me that
I
the
did not say
enhanced
that.
interrogation...
I did not say that. We do not torture. Listen to me.
Well, you call it in the book enhanced interrogation.
Well, that's what we call it.
I mean, that's
So,
a euphemism.
well, I'm not having a semantic debate with you. I'm telling you what I believe.
Anybody ever die in the interrogation program?
No.
You're sure of that?
Yeah. In this program that you and I are talking about, no.
Have you ever seen any of these interrogations done?
No.
Didn't you feel like it was your responsibility to know what you were signing off on?
I'm not a voyeur. I understand what I was signing off on.
Lose any sleep over it?
Yeah, of course you do. Of course you lose sleep over it. You're on new territory, but that's not the point. What's this tension? So the tension is, I've just lived through 3,000 people dying. This is not a clinical exercise. Maybe for you guys it's a clinical exercise. Not for me. 3,000 people died. Friends died. Now I'm going to sit back, and then everybody says, you idiots don't know how to connect the dots. You don't have imagination. You are unwilling to take risks to protect this country.
Let me ask the question this way. Why were enhanced interrogation techniques necessary?
Because these are people that will never, ever, ever tell you a thing. These are people who know who's responsible for the next terrorist attack. These are hardened people that would kill you and me 30 seconds after they got out of wherever they're being held and wouldn't blink an eyelash. You can sit there 5 years later and have this debate with me. All I'm asking you to do, walk a mile in my shoes when I'm dealing with these realities.
Reasonable people will disagree. I don't think anyone can disagree about the passion that George Tenet felt for his job. We found out just this year that it was the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed that led to the name of the courier who we followed for years and finally to the home of Osama bin Laden. These are difficult questions. And reasonable people on both sides of that line will disagree. Ladies and gentlemen, it has been such a great pleasure to be with you tonight, but an especially great pleasure to be part of this Richard Salant series. I want you to know a little bit of something about how important Richard Salant is to CBS News and is to the nation. He was News Division president, as I mentioned a couple of times, in the 60s and the 70s. He literally wrote the book that we all have on our desks today, which is the CBS News Standards book. And they are the rules that we live by every single day. Richard changed the 15-minute evening news broadcast to the 30-minute evening news broadcast. And though he tried to kill 60 Minutes, he finally gave it the go-ahead and made that momentous decision to convince the network to run it at 7 o'clock on Sunday, which changed everything and made it America's #1 news program. We all in this room owe Richard Salant so much. And Nathan, your grandfather, set the standard for all of us, and you should be enormously, enormously proud. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your kind attention tonight. It's been great to be with you. I understand that we want to take a few questions and that there are microphones that are set up in various places. This is the most dangerous part of the evening for me, but it's always a lot of fun as well. So help me understand. Do we need to get microphones to? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to my wife, Jane, for starting that round of applause. That was, thank you so very much, honey. That was great. Now, first question, please. I've got lights in my face, so I really can't see you very well. So let me just...
I have the first question?
Yes, sir.
Right here. Should I go? Oh, okay.
There you are. All right.
First of all, fantastic speech. Congratulations first on moving the dial on the CBS Evening News. I happen to follow the ratings every week, and you're now getting 88% in the demo to ABC. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much.
And my question is this. I happen to record both the CBS and the NBC News every night, and sometimes the shows are so much, it's hard to believe they actually follow the same news. What do you and your producers say when you hear what goes on the other shows, and it's so much different?
Full disclosure, this man is not a relative of mine. You know, we have an office at the Evening News in Studio 47 where we do the broadcast. It's called the Fishbowl because it's enclosed in glass. And myself, my executive producer, Pat Shevlin, and my senior producers all come into the Fishbowl about 8:30 in the morning, and we start working on the broadcast and figure out exactly what we're going to cover, how we're going to cover it, talking to the correspondents and the producers about what interests us, finding out what they are learning in the field. And, you know, we are, at the CBS Evening News, we are looking for the 12 or so most important things that happened today. You know, as I go around the country talking to people, I hear people tell me that they're tired of all the veiled opinion on television. They're tired of the shaky information on the internet. They're tired of entertainment passing itself off as news, which was one of the core principles of Richard Salant, by the way, keeping news and entertainment separated. And when I hear all of that, I hear a yearning for a straight ahead, right down the middle broadcast that just tells the facts of what happened in one day, so that it's one compilation in 30 minutes and you can be fairly certain that you've heard everything that was an important news-making event in that particular day. So we have this debate all day long, and we all talk all day long. One of the great things about CBS News is my director worked for Walter Cronkite, and one of my senior producers in the Fishbowl worked for Walter Cronkite. So often we look up and say, Jimmy, what would Walter do? Seriously. And there's a great kid who's now working in our political unit named Walter Leland Cronkite IV. Terrific young man. He's about 24 years old. He's Walter's grandson. And so I get emails now from Walter Cronkite. And it's still, after months, it's still jarring when I see an email from Walter Cronkite. Another question, please? Yes, sir.
I'd like to congratulate you for avoiding the attack of your computer.
I'm not sure we avoided it, but we did overcome it. It's like the Marines say, is adapt and overcome.
I've never seen anybody successfully get around that one. With Ben Bernanke, did he have any comments on what could have been done, or do you have any ideas what could have been done to avoid some of the financial disaster that took place?
Well, we've done a couple of interviews with Chairman Bernanke now, and I asked him, what do you regret? And he said in the interview that the Federal Reserve absolutely should have done a better job of policing these systemically important banks, these banks that we've all come to know as too big to fail. He said the Federal Reserve did not do a good enough job policing those banks to make sure that they knew what those balance sheets really looked like. A lot of that has changed now, and yet we just saw MF Global collapse last week. So obviously not everything has been fixed. I was doing an interview that's going to be on the CBS Evening News tomorrow with a Wall Street titan, and created a giant global fund. He's 82 years old. He's on his second heart. He had a heart transplant 16 years ago. John Bogle started the Vanguard funds. And I said in the interview, I said, well, John, you have been one of the great builders of Wall Street as we know it today. What would you do to fix Wall Street? And he looked up and he said, wiretaps. He said, you start putting some of these guys in jail and they'll start doing what's right for America. Another question?
It's a pleasure to have you in New Canaan. Thank you so much for coming.
We love New Canaan. Thank you very much.
We've been watching on the news, and of course we've all been reading on the internet what's happening down with the Occupy Wall Street movement, and of course it's not limited to Wall Street. It's all over the country and in other countries in the world as well. I, the other day, received a poll from Fidelity Investments asking me, as a client, what I thought about Occupy Wall Street. I thought it was interesting that they were interested. And I'm curious to hear from you. You mentioned that the president's approval rating is low, and you mentioned that among Republicans, the hope for another candidate is high. Occupy Wall Street had, I read on the internet, a plan which was shelved to run a third-party candidate in every election in the country, which is obviously very ambitious, and they voted it down. But to what extent do you think Occupy Wall Street will end up being something that our grandchildren will read about in their history books? Or do you think this is just a,
I think Occupy Wall Street reflects a concern all over the country about the durability of the American dream and whether the next generation will enjoy a greater or lesser standard of living than the current generation does. I think for the first time in modern American history, it may be the case that the next generation does not enjoy the same standard of living or a greater one. Occupy Wall Street has no leaders. It's very similar to what happened in Cairo, actually. It is an internet, Facebook kind of thing, and by definition, there is no leader. There's no Mandela. There's nobody for anyone to rally around. We sent some correspondence into the Occupy Wall Street in Zagati Park in Manhattan a few weeks ago, and we just went around and asked people, why are you here? Well, this guy was upset with Wall Street, but the next guy was concerned about how American Indians had been treated in the 19th century, and the next lady was concerned about women's rights, and it just seemed to be a not very sharply focused group of people, just kind of a general sense of unhappiness with what's happening in the country. One of the things that we've noticed at the Evening News is last year at this time, all three network evening news broadcasts added together had 20 million viewers a night. This year, we have 21 million viewers a night. All of the evening news broadcasts are growing. And that suggests to me that folks are concerned about what's happening in this country and that they're looking for information about which way the country is headed. So the Occupy Wall Street and Oakland and Chicago and all over this country, a fascinating grassroots development, but I wonder if it has legs, if you will, because of the fact that it is so diffuse and not sharply focused. Now, this side of the room has lots of questions. This side of the room has none, and I wonder why that is. Yes, ma'am.
Scott, have you or any of your peers at 60 Minutes ever been pressured by the White House to not run a story or asked to change it?
Not that I've ever been aware of. Absolutely not. You know, I had somebody ask me the other day about an interview that I did with the president, the person asked me, well, what questions do they let you ask? What questions do they let me ask? This is America. I mean, it's the First Amendment. There is no interference from the White House about what questions we can ask the president. They don't even ask because they know what the answer is going to be. But there is something that they can control: the president's time. And when I did my last interview with George Bush at Camp David, I was sitting there knee to knee with the president in Laurel Canyon. We were talking about Iraq and the surge and all of that. And there was a guy standing in my eye line, but outside the view of the camera with cards. And the cards were like 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds. And so what they do is they don't restrict the questions that you ask, but they restrict the time in which you have to ask them. It is a truism that the best exchanges, like what you saw with George Tenet on 60 Minutes, are never the questions you have written down on your lap. It's always in the follow-ups and following up on the follow-ups and building on what the interview subject just said to you. And restricting the time with the president restricts the number of follow-ups that you can ask. When I sat down for that interview, I had my questions all written down. We sat down. The president looked over on my lap and he said, "Those your questions?" And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." And he said, "Well, you better start cutting them back." But he's a baseball fan, right? So just a little brushback pitch right there at the beginning of the interview. Another question, please. Yes, sir.
Thank you for taking my question. Actually, it relates to another question in the Q&A answer. One of your distinguished colleagues visited Fairfield University, Lara Logan, just about a month ago, and I asked her a question because there was a lot of focus. She's chief international correspondent for CBS. So I was asking about somebody within the Obama administration because he impresses me with his credentials, and he seems to really know what he's doing, and it would be a fascinating interview. And I'm talking about Leon Panetta, and she said, well, I think Scott Pelley is going to do a future interview with him because I would eagerly await that, and everybody would certainly learn something from that. I'm sure he would speak about what he, in some confidentiality, in some areas he can't touch its security, but I think it would be a great interview. Is that true?
Yes, it is. We're shooting right now, we're in the middle of shooting a profile of Leon Panetta, who most of you know is the Secretary of Defense, and before that was the Director of Central Intelligence, has really created this CIA Air Force of drones that is now at war and at work in Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and other places. And so we are doing a profile with Secretary Panetta. He's a terrific guy. We did one interview with him already. These 60 Minutes profiles, they take a long time to shoot. We shoot an interview, and then we figure what we've missed, and we shoot another interview. We go places around the world with these folks. But when you see a profile in 60 Minutes, I mean, it's very much like a movie. An enormous amount of time and effort goes into them. I sat down with Secretary Panetta. I'll tell you this. Don't tell anybody, because it hasn't been on the air yet, right? So, but I'll give you a little sneak preview. We sat down at the Pentagon together a couple of weeks ago. And I said, so Mr. Secretary, how many countries are we at war with? And he couldn't answer. He said, well, wait. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and he started to count them up on his, he had to stop and think because of all of these conflicts that we're involved in all around the world because of the global war on terror. So it'll be a fascinating interview, I'm sure, and I've got great people working on that. One of the downsides of being a television correspondent is that we get far too much credit for the work of others. Every story that you see on the evening news or you see on 60 Minutes is the work of an incredible team of reporters, producers, cameramen, editors, sound men, senior producers who all work in collaboration. This is like the ultimate team sport in a profession beyond sports. Thank you for that question.
I would just ask one
See, I
remark.
told
I'm
you
sorry.
it's always the follow-ups that are...
It's not a follow-up question, but somebody said, you've told us so much, Laura Logan, about what goes on behind the scenes and boots on the ground and the people and the Taliban you've talked to. why don't you write a book about that? And she said, oh, I'm afraid CBS would fire me if I said what I really want to say.
I don't know about that. A lot of books get written by a lot of correspondents, and they're fascinating reads.
How about one more question?
Absolutely. These folks have got to go watch 60 Minutes. You've only got about half an hour before you need to be home. I want to see all of you at home. And the end of daylight savings time, that's a great thing for 60 Minutes. We love that. We like dark, cold, stormy Sunday nights. One more question then?
I have a question over
yes,
here.
Please.
My name is Charlotte Bergman, and I'm actually a senior here at St. Luke's this year. And I do have a question, but I just wanted to say that your humility and search for the truth, especially for young people like me, is really inspiring. And I can definitely say that on behalf of all of my peers and friends. But I just wanted to ask, as a young person, what or who inspired you to become a journalist? Was it a teacher? Was it a family member? Was it a certain experience?
Marjorie Wilson was my high school journalism teacher, and she was on fire to teach. You walked into Marjorie Wilson's class and great things happened. I couldn't wait to get there. Went to Marjorie Wilson's classroom before school started because she was just so much fun to be with. Went to class during the day, came back and spent the afternoon and early evening with her in her classroom afterwards as well, as did a large number of people who were students at Coronado High School in Lubbock, Texas. There is just nothing in this world that is as powerful as a teacher who's on fire to teach, whatever subject it may be. And I'll never forget when Mrs. Wilson, who's still living today in Texas, Mrs. Wilson told me that there was a copy boy job available at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal newspaper, which was an overnight job. You went to work at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, perfect, because we got out of high school at 2:30, and then you worked till midnight, working in the wire room, feeding these wire machines which don't exist anymore with paper and ribbons and all of that, and making sure the copy got all around to the right editors. And I went over to the Avalanche Journal to apply, and discovered, I'm 15 years old, and I discovered that they only hire kids beginning at 16. So they said, how old are you? And I said, 16. So my lifelong pursuit of the truth began with a lie.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much. Thank you. Great to be with you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Very kind.
And thank you all for attending. Please join us on the second floor. For those of you that need an elevator, there will be people at the back to direct you down. And it's the St. Luke's School Commons with a reception with Scott. Thank you.